Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. My name is Sarah Ortega, I'm the Marketing Manager here at Smarking. Just want to say thanks for joining us and give you a little overview of your control panel. So we will be doing a Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. So if you have any questions throughout, please feel free to use your GoToWebinar control panel. There's a section on there for questions. You can chat in there and we'll make sure to address them at the end of today's session. And if you have any questions throughout, feel free to message me directly through our chat. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope you enjoy.
Thanks, Sarah. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Wen. I'm the CEO of Smarking. We're a technology company based in San Francisco, serving over 2,000 parking sites across North America, helping people to extract value out of their real-time parking data. So today, we're very fortunate to have two of the very thought leaders from the industry, Dan Roarty from Arrive and Rick West, the CEO of Millennium Garages. As we all know, we're getting into we're probably 10 plus weeks into the pandemic, and the landscape of our entire industry has shifted tremendously. So today, we'll have Dan and Rick share their perspectives on now what everything changed, what is the new normal, how to find the new normal, and from where we are, how do we look ahead and get prepared to rebound from this whole pandemic crisis. As Sarah mentioned, at the second section, we'll have opportunities for everyone to ask questions. So please type in your questions whenever you feel so, and we'll make sure to take care of them later in the session. Today in the session, we really have three parts for the discussion with the panelists. First, we'll let everybody talk a little bit about what they're seeing on the market. And then we'll get onto what is their thinking in terms of, based off what we're seeing, what is the best way to position for the next steps to position for the rebound, and then some recommendations for the industry peers. So to get started, before we get into the meat and the potatoes, I'll let Dan and Rick talk just a little bit about themselves in terms of their business and who they are. I bet pretty much everybody in the audience probably know them already, but we'll just let them introduce themselves quickly. Dan, please.
Sure, thanks for having me, Wen. Again, this is great to kind of reconnect after I think the last session we had, which was about a month ago. So I'm Dan Roarty. I'm the president and COO of Arrive. Arrive runs consumer apps like ParkWiz and Best Parking, and we also power parking services for brands like Ticketmaster and General Motors and Amazon. And so we've, obviously, like everyone, been very impacted by this pandemic in some expected and unexpected ways as well. But we're right now starting to feel a sense of recovery and kind of starting to see some new things emerge. So happy to dig into those today.
Thanks, Dan. Rick?
Hi, I'm Rick West. I'm the CEO, as Wen said, of the Millennium Garages in Chicago. Most of you are familiar with that, but it's over 9,000 parking spaces and 4 underground parking garages that are underneath all the parks in the Chicago Loop District. It'll certainly be part of my comments today, what's been going on there, reflective of, I think, Chicago, but also the scale of a facility like that. I also am an owner, co-owner of 3 parking garages in 3 different cities, so I invest in urban parking as well. So I will bring that perspective to the table too. Thank you, Wen.
Thank you, Rick. So quickly, we'll take a good look at what we're seeing from the Smarking's end across the board in the U.S. Parking industry. I'll just share my screen. And so as some of the audience may remember, we have been publishing some of the cross-border data in the industry since the beginning of the pandemic to help industry peers to understand where the market is. And lately, we actually developed this into a product module called Industry Benchmark to essentially screen through, for example, here for off-street locations, 900 locations across the country. As we can see, this is a sample of the key metrics that we're tracking in terms of revenue of this year compared to last year in percentages on daily basis. From the beginning of the pandemic, before we were year over year actually positive in terms of business is growing. But then in the beginning of the pandemic, clearly within a week, the revenue for off-street transit and parking went down to less than 10% of last year. Lately, there are some variations, as Dan and Rick mentioned, that we're seeing some signals of recovering. But if we wanted to really see the trend, if we go to a weekly view, we can really see that. Sorry, it's just loading. In the past few weeks, I believe we're seeing, although slight, but fairly clear trend of across the board recovery. This is to, let's see if it's to the week of the 16th. So although the data across the board is to a certain extent pretty positive, I would totally imagine for different regions, there will be different trend. And we'll let Dan shortly comment on what he is seeing from an online perspective, and Rick comment on what are some of the concrete data they're seeing. So on a weekly basis, I think the trend is rather clear that we probably got to the valley point in the week of April 6th or 13th. We were down to probably just roughly more than 6% of last year. And now coming back into the past few weeks, we're passing that 10% threshold. And same trend goes with the transactions. We got to the valley point in the second or the third week of April, and gradually, slightly, we're coming back. Now we're up to roughly down 80% or 20% of the same time period last year's volume. So this is what we're seeing across the board, Dan and Rick. What are you guys seeing? What do you see as the new normal? I'll just pull it over here and let Dan talk a little bit about his observation from an online standpoint.
Sure. So the good news is we are starting to see signs of recovery. We have the exact same data that suggests that the lowest part of the trough was that week of April 6th. And each week since then, we've seen a very slow and sequential recovery. And what's interesting is this is happening not just in the cities that are opening up, like Atlanta or Denver, places like that, but also in New York City and Chicago and other markets that are still remain shut down. So here in this graph, you can see, and what we're looking at, this happens to be just Google Trends data. Anyone can go to trends.google.com and look at this. But this is a very good leading indicator of parking interest. So as cities start to open up, as employees start to think about getting back to work, and particularly in those cities that maybe the employees used to take trains or transit a lot, people are starting to think about how are they going to get to work, what is it going to cost me, where can I park near my office, those sorts of things. And you'd expect that you'd see some of that activity show up in Google first as people do searches. And that's exactly what you're starting to see here. But it's definitely a city by city journey. So cities like New York and Chicago and Boston that have a fair amount of transit takers, you can see Google queries are starting to spike up. But in Detroit, for example, where everyone drives, you can see that even though activity may be picking up in Detroit, search activity is not. And so, this is, obviously cars parked is the best indicator of a recovery, but starting to see these trends move up is an encouraging sign. And we're starting to see it in our business as well. So we're also, getting back to, 20% of normal each week, and each week is getting better than the last. If you go back one, the one after that, sorry, next one. Yep. There you go, right there. What's also interesting is we're seeing increased activity happen faster in markets that we don't necessarily associate with kind of heavy online parking searches. So, Atlanta, you would expect it to come up as that city was one of the earlier ones to start opening up. But Tampa, for example, is an interesting surprise here. Tampa's not a super densely packed downtown core. It's not like Manhattan. There aren't a lot of transit problems, but you're seeing parking interest rise up pretty quickly there. And what we've seen is starting to see in people's searches, words like contactless and touchless and things like that are starting to creep into the search terms that people are typing in. So clearly, as people get back to work, either they're trying to solve, how do I park because I used to take the train, or if they, have always driven, they're starting to think about, okay, where is it safe to park? Where can I go that maybe is taking extra safety precautions so I can reduce my risk? So all of these things are interesting learning so far. And then the next slide, if you wanted to show it real quick. And what this is showing is distribution of start times for parking on our platform by month. And so it starts at May this month at the top and then goes back into history down below. And you can see pre-COVID, you can see the largest proportion of start times were concentrated around that 8 and 9 a.m. hour. This is all local time. And now you can see in the kind of COVID era, it's really spread out a lot more and starting a lot earlier. And so the distribution of parking start times is much wider over a larger number of hours, from starting at 5 a.m. till 10 a.m. And some of this is self-fulfilling. The people that have been parking probably are essential workers, probably working in medical centers and things like that, who tend, probably have earlier starting jobs. So this may change and go back to the norm, but we just thought this was interesting to share as we see these behaviors. And the implication for parking operators, for example, could be that maybe a traditional early bird product needs to take on a different form or have different rules, because you might have people starting at 5 a.m. and people starting at 10 a.m. You have people at home who maybe have to deal with getting their kids squared away for homeschooling or for whatever reason. And so the traditional idea of a 9 to 5 commute may start to see different patterns emerge, and we're going to have to react appropriately.
Thank you, Dan. So it sounds like, on one hand, the trend that you're observing from an online standpoint is fairly consistent with offline transactions across the board, that we're seeing signals of recovery. But it's really a journey city by city, that different markets are having different trends. For example, for Tampa, obviously the policy changed, the shelter in place got lifted, and the trend goes up a lot faster, looks like. And it looks like there are indeed change of consumer behaviors just based off observation of how much ahead people would start booking their reservations and so on, which could be an indicator of how post-COVID-19 people's perspective of how parking services should be would change to a certain extent.
100%. I think, and as we've spoken with innumerable operators, this idea that the traditional commuters need a lot more flexibility is, I think, going to take root. I think a lot of people that formerly were monthly parkers may only need to come into the office 2 or 3 days a week because the office is trying to reduce density or allowing more flexibility for work from home. And so for our part, we've worked to improve our products so that we can offer things like flexible parking packages and tools like that. But I think whether it's when people start their parking, the duration of parking, how many days a week they park, all of that's going to shift around a bit, and we're going to have to react quickly. I don't think any of us can predict exactly where it will settle, but there will be some new pattern that is different from the old one, as you can see in this chart.
Thank you. That makes sense. And I know, Rick, that you have collected some data from Millennium garages as well. I just pulled them out, and would love to have your help to see your observations, and what do you think is the new normal?
Sure. Can you put the chart up that I sent you?
Yep.
And while you're doing that, one comment just actually on Smarking and Win. I know myself and others in the industry had reached out to Win and said at the beginning of COVID and said, really, we need anonymized data that can be looked at. So you don't know whose data it is, but it helps tell the story to all of us of what's going on. We've asked him to create new services and new products so that he could get a deeper pool of locations to draw from. And so I encourage you to reach out to Smarking, because to some degree, he's being great about letting everyone see his data now, but at some point, not all data that is important to see, but it will be anonymized, and he has data from our locations. So first of all, this chart right here, this is basically what I wanted to focus on, among other things, with the Millennium garages, was just physically how many cars were parking on a day-to-day basis. So what the colors show you is essentially the green is people who purchased online. The red are just physical monthly parkers in the garage on a given day. The bottom one that's blue, which is credit cards on file, that's already a product that Millennium's had for years. which is if you're not a monthly parker because you don't park often enough, you can have a credit card on file, you have a similar credential, and you go in and go out, and it just hits your credit card on the way out at the rate at whatever is negotiated with that group account. And then we have and then of course on the top, the purple is the transient, so people who pay on exit. And so you see the drop when it really drops down in March and then drops down again to about 2,500 cars, and that's per week. And then we have the first one where it goes to its low point was the shelter at home directive from the governor of Illinois. You see right away it went down and it stabilized immediately. So that was an interesting first trend, was just to see the first week of shelter at home, it went to its low point, and then it stayed flat, though it creeped up a little bit. And then, as Dan said, what we're seeing from this physical car count is we are seeing that every week got a little bit better. And it was mainly weekday, but now that the weather's getting nicer in Chicago, we're also seeing the weekends get a lot better and busy as well too. Two things to really point out is the red, which is monthly parking, is we've really seen the monthly parking just be steady, but keep growing of how many are in the garage. Where we've really seen the growth is in the drive-up transient, so people just coming in and pulling a ticket. And I do think one of the things to draw a contrast, where I own my garages are Cleveland, Louisville, and Nashville. So smaller markets, very different, all of them. But we're not seeing that same trend in those markets yet. And I think some of that is, in these big metropolitan markets, which was some of the data that Dan focused on, the depth of demand generators and the density of demand generators, there was always activity going on. Even if it's just essential worker, it still has some scale to it versus, in the three other markets, especially Louisville and Cleveland, their garage is right in the center of the city, but when the workers go home, there's not a lot of other demand generators around. So essentially, they're coming back more slowly. We're seeing in Nashville, it's coming back a little faster, but it's still a secondary size city. The bars are still essentially closed. So we're looking forward to when they open. But it's also got a bigger residential component, especially by our garage. And so we are seeing that. We service hotels in a lot of these markets. And I was speaking to a GM in Nashville, and they're kind of at a 10% occupancy right now. And I know in some things data I've been following, we're seeing a dispersion in how the higher end hotels are coming back much slower than the economy value hotels. And so that's another interesting pattern there. Before we came on air, one of the things I was sharing with Dan and Wen was actually, we saw yesterday, our average occupancy jump by 200. So we're up to over 1,800 cars a day. Far short from where we used to be, but it's still great. And Dan said he saw the same thing in the cities that he keeps an eye on as well too. So that's kind of what's going on now in terms of just from a straight volume standpoint. Wen?
Thank you, Red. So I have to ask this now, because we all know that the shelter in place is still the case in Chicago. What do you think is the driving force here, really seeing this week over week recovery already?
Well, I think, as Dan already pointed out, in some of these big metropolitan areas, it's the flight from mass transit. So in Chicago, traditionally about 2/3 of people who work in the city and commute from the suburbs come by private car, and 1/3 come by mass transit, which is predominantly commuter rail. So I think it's just the people that are coming back in, it's a shift of market share from mass transit to driving. I know in New York City, where the stock exchange opened up yesterday, and they opened up not for a lot of people, but one of the things they said is, if you take mass transit, we're not going to let you in, even if you have a fever, no fever, whatever the case may be. So I think it's people's natural behavior, but I think there's also some policy starting to creep in, even if it's not official policy, though in this case, it was on CNBC, so official policy. And I know that they also had the head of the MTA in New York City on the air yesterday, and the data she gave is that they're starting to creep back up, but they're coming back more slowly than the parking is. Otherwise, a lot of people who are considered essential workers haven't come back into the office yet. So like banks were always considered essential, but the banks sent everyone home. And there's a lot of other businesses that fall into that category too. And then I remember when COVID first started, GameStop announced on TV that they considered themselves an essential service. So I think there's a big hole. If you want to drive through it, you can drive through it, and no one's going to stop you from going to work.
Thanks, Rick. So it sounds like, go ahead, Dan.
Well, I was going to say, I think, Rick, I think you hinted at this as well, that companies are going to take varied approaches to how they plan their employees coming back. So, and it's going to have an unknown impact. On one hand, you've got potentially these companies that are mandating that people take private cars and not public transit. On the other side, you have states like California and soon to be Illinois who are making COVID cases a workers' comp issue if you do go back to work. And that's going to cause companies to maybe only bring back the people that they necessarily have to. So who knows which of those things is going to weigh out in terms of, less people taking trains means more parkers overall, but maybe companies are going to have a very conservative approach on how they bring people back. And of course, you hear about like tech companies like Twitter and others that are kind of trying to completely abandon offices. So
right.
You take the good with the bad. Our belief, and as we look at this, we think we are going to get back to some sense of normal, but it's going to be because we have the downside of less people per square foot in offices coming back, but more people from more companies who used to take trains that will offset that, and hopefully it gets us back to some sense of normal. It's just going to be a different mix of customers entirely than from before.
Yes. So to your point, that's a very interesting point, because exactly as you said, so many factors could come into play. Policy, the change of the people's perception of how public transit would work for them, how employers or big tenants would think about how they wanted to or not bring back their employees, and also so many things are in the play. And before COVID-19, it's pretty clear parking business grows with the U.S. economy, and we're growing. Business is good. Now, after COVID-19, seems like everything changed. So many things changed, and there's so many things in the play. And how do we find that new normal? What is the new normal? What are some of your sort of perspectives on how some other industries are trying to define the new normal? What is because everybody would need to know what is good, what is bad. Now, what do we operate benchmark against, right? What are some of your please?
Yeah, so two things. I mean, one, the value of a parking garage or a parking lot, and forget parking lots that are really development sites, because that's their value. 5 years ago, 7 years ago, you basically said every garage in X city had a value of X cap rate, whether it was a 5 cap in a city with really high cost of land and things, or whether it was a 6 and a 6.5 cap or a 7 cap, whatever the case may be. Mm-hmm. When ride hail came in, all of a sudden it was like, well, the value of a garage is very different. It depends on its demand generators. So if you were generating X revenue and X profits at a garage that was in an entertainment area, well, if people are going out drinking in an entertainment area, those garages really got hurt much more so than other locations that had different demand generation profiles around them. So I think what we're actually going to see is a similar situation here, is that different parking locations based upon the demand mix that they have around them are going to behave differently. So it's not just different regions and different cities. It's going to be just different locations in the same city, maybe even that are nearby. We definitely, in the case of, this is very true in Nashville as well too, but in Chicago, I look at kind of how we're going to come back is the first thing that will come back are workers, so commuters. And we're going to be the beneficiary of the tailwind of a couple tailwinds, really. One is the shift from mass transit, which I think is going to last at least in a lingering way. So the volume shift may peter out over time, but I think a lot of it's going to linger in terms of drive by car. But we also see the tailwind of the fact that our main customer base for those locations is white collar workers, and they're the ones who didn't get laid off predominantly. They're faring much better because they can work from home, and their companies have the balance sheets and access to capital to not have to lay everybody off. So the second thing we see coming back is kind of what we're calling daily tourism. And daily tourism in Chicago with the parks is in part actually just tied to weather, besides daily events, but there's also just weather. So we've really seen, as soon as the weather got nice in Chicago on the weekend, we actually saw our business triple and quadruple tied to the weather on Saturdays and Sundays. The last bucket, though, which I kind of say is multi-day business and leisure tourism, but people coming and staying in hotels. And a lot of that's tied to large events, and I'm putting large events into that bucket as well, too. And I think that's going to be a long time coming. So if you're used to, like, one of my garage in Louisville is near a convention center, well, that's going to have a different trajectory back because the convention center is going to have a different trajectory back. And the hotels that are around us were around us in part tied to the convention center as well, too. So I don't think involved with locations I'm involved with, it's going to be different things at different places in terms of pace and how much it recovers. And that's going to go into the value of these things as well, too.
Thank you, Rick. So go ahead, Dan. Mute it.
I'd agree, Rick, and I think our business is always. I don't think so. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, all good.
Can you hear me, Ben?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Our business has also been split across, commuters and workers versus entertainment versus travel-oriented people as well. And I think we've looked at it the same way, that we think the entertainment-based business, particularly the large events, is going to take a very long time to come back. So even if there's a vaccine, and even if there's kind of the all clear sign from a health perspective, it'll take a while before people, number one, have the money to go back to events and spend money. I think people are going to be skittish on a lot of those splurges for some period of time. And number two, it's going to take a while for the event industry to just get itself organized again and get things rescheduled and so forth, right? Big promoters, obviously we've seen the sports leagues are still struggling, trying to get plans back in place as there's so much fluidity to things. So for us, we're spending our near-term effort on the commuter recovery first and foremost, and making sure that we're well prepared for that, and that we're maximizing every bit of outreach and every bit of coordination that we can do with operators, with large employers, and so forth, just to make sure that the tools are in place to do that. And then, hopefully by the time we get to the fall and there's more understanding of what's going to happen on the event landscape, then we can gear back up for that. And I agree with Rick that I think travel will be kind of the last thing to kick back in, probably in 2021.
So I will jump in here and say I'm getting on my first airline flight June 17th, so I'm getting back in the air.
You're ahead of pretty much everybody there. And it's a business trip?
Yep. Well, business and pleasure. Since instead of going to Chicago, 2.5, 3 days at a time, my wife is coming too, and we rented an apartment. We're going to be there for 8 nights, and so we are modifying, and we feel better that we'll be in control of our space more so than a hotel. So.
Sounds like one of those multi-day leisure trip as you just described.
Yeah, there's going to be some leisure.
Cool. So thank you, Jed. So it sounds like on one hand, your perspectives are likely the workforce, although there will be changes in terms of how people are going to occupy the space and so on, that'll be one of the first groups to come back, and likely the event and travel will come in later. So with all of these perspectives, when it comes to operating a parking business, when it comes to decide what to expect, what is good performance, what is bad performance, how do you make those decisions now in this new reality? Before, we all set budget goals and it's based off last year's revenue performance, but now with this whole thing, everything changed. What would be your perspective on good practice when it comes to setting the goals for the rest of 2020, and what is good?
Let me jump in on. Yeah, well, what's good is making enough money that you can survive. Because if you can survive, then other good things can happen after that. Mm-hmm. So if you're a parking operator and you have leases and you have fixed rent, I mean it's kind of carnage out there when your revenue drops down, but your largest fixed expense is potentially your rent. And and then of course the landlords have mortgages on their buildings or property, and so it's a first derivative, second derivative, third derivative, and I think just from that standpoint, a couple of points. Number one, whether you're a parking company that only does managements, or whether you have leases, or whether you're any other kind of company anywhere in the globe right now, what is enough liquidity to maintain on your balance sheet is not something we used to think about. Parking was always like, okay, into the quarter, here's all the, here's our excess cash flow, distribute it to the owners or whatever, or it goes up to the company, but now it's like, well, wait a minute, I want to have a year's worth of liquidity if I've got mortgages and other things, that I've got to deal with. Now, in the case of the Millennium garages, it's a concession, and it was upfront. So in other words, the concession was bought from the government for an upfront amount back a dozen years ago. So we don't have rent and real estate tax because technically they're still owned. So our actually operating break-even point for the size of our facilities is very, very low. So we actually are very fortunate from that standpoint that we, from an operating standpoint, if we get back to 40, 50%, we're actually generating a lot of free cash flow. Not, of course, it's now a lousy investment, but at least it's a safe investment, and then we can climb from there. Now, of course, we do have mortgage when we acquired it, so then we have to take that into consideration. But that's part of what we have to manage too. But that's been our first thing, is how fast can we get back to that we're just in control of our own world, and so then you can be much more on offense in how you approach the market, because everything just changed and it's not going back to the way it was. I mean, we saw with the in the 89 to 91 recession, and when I was in Massachusetts and Boston, and then I was shortly thereafter started being very active with Kenny Parking in the New York market. And one of the things that was interesting, and I know I mentioned to you guys, but I'll put it out there here, is the New York market was all leases. And so when the recession occurred, it was just like everyone wanted to get out of leases, not enter into new leases. And that's kind of where everyone is right now. I mean, there's a parking company in the Washington D.C. area that declared bankruptcy, and they declared bankruptcy really just to get out of all those leases that they're underwater and don't know when they'll ever stop bleeding money on them. But in around 92 or 3, Kenny Parking, where I worked, and Icon Parking, which still exists in the city, were the first ones to say, let's go back and start doing new leases again. And so kind of from 92, 93, 94, when most of the parking companies were still sitting on the sidelines, we made our best deals that we made in 15 years. Because all of a sudden, because we just had that appetite for that little bit more risk before the other guys did. And it became a real huge opportunity. And so I think, you got to look at things and think about things like that. But right now, I think it's just everyone's looking at, how do I have enough cash flow to survive? How do I bring down my operating costs to the lowest point I can? And I'm never going to let those operating costs go back to where they were.
Survive first, and then think about offense opportunities.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think survival was the name of the game. Like this was an unanticipated and massive shift in dynamics, in revenue dynamics that I think, only a few people, who in hindsight will claim they were smart enough to see this coming. Now that it's past us, I think a couple things are true. One is I think all of us are gaining comfort that, this is a manageable situation at least, and that the likelihood that we swing back to some massive lockdown, the odds of that happening again are lower and lower by the day. I think science and medical professionals and so forth are starting to understand this thing a little bit better and the nature of it. And obviously, I think we understand the impact, and I think nobody wants to go back to where we were, end of March, early April. And so I think, where there's precautions that can be taken, whether it's masks or reducing density in offices, people will do that. And so I think we won't swing back to where we were, but we will continue to climb out of it. And so for us, we've just planned a broad range of scenarios from kind of low expectations to medium to high. And we've made sure that we can survive any one of those three. And if anything better than the lowest scenarios happen, we'll be in a position to invest and to Rick's point, take advantage of the new trends, the new things, right? So for us, we've been investing in mobile payments and mobile parking and digital parking solutions for over a decade. Well, now it so happens that those investments are in demand more than ever. 6 months ago, it was more about convenience. Now it's about convenience and safety and everything else. So for us, we're going to keep our heads down, keep making our investments in supporting operators, supporting the parking community, and upgrading technologies and so forth. And we've seen this from our partners as well. We've seen the parks companies, for example, Park Connect, Flash, Shiba, like others have really stepped up their game in terms of collaborating and investing and making sure that we've got the tools necessary to support the industry, move towards digital payments, touchless payments, contactless payments, and so forth. And at the same time, give everybody the tools necessary to move rates faster, working with UN, obviously, to help operators respond faster as rates take shape and kind of new normal takes shape. And that's where we've got to spend our time now. And then hopefully, as Rick hinted at, in 6 months, we'll be in a position where we can start to look more long-term again. And the people that move fast will take advantage of those opportunities and put themselves in a good position for the long term. And hopefully we'll be there with you.
Thank you, Dan.
One thing I'll add to that, to that, Dan, is fast is what was considered fast is now slow. I mean, when I look at the Millennium Garages, what we've gotten done in the last 4 weeks, that would have taken us at least 6 months. And we were just like, we got to have it now. So one of the things, and this is a good news, bad news story for some of in the industry, is we've been considering for the last 18 months what new park system would we buy for the facilities, and it was probably going to be about a $2 million investment. Well, we hadn't yet selected and ordered, and this hit. So we immediately said, well, we're not doing that. We can't make a $2 million investment right now, because we were, 6 weeks ago, we were still questioning, survivability and how, just still reacting to things. Fortunately, more because we wanted to protect our data, we had upgraded our servers with new servers at the location with our existing technology platform. And one of the things we'd never considered, but because we updated our servers which we got done in first half of February, when we went back to our technology provider and said, we need this, this, and this, and we need it now, and you need to help us, and can we layer this in on our existing system? And he said, yes, because you put in new servers. And so now we just did, still a significant investment for today's, over 100,000, but we got like 4 things, which were some of the things we wanted to buy a whole new system for. And so we feel like, okay, maybe we'll buy that new system, but it's going to be at some to be determined time in the future. But we're able to go white labeled with an app to go touchless because they've developed it, and it's not really been, I don't think they've sold a lot of it, but now it's like, well, we'll do it. And so that's going to be good for them, because that's going to help them improve their product and have a showcase. We wanted the ability to, essentially mass produce barcodes that are individual and that could be programmed to do anything we wanted them to do. Once again, so we could sell any product we can imagine up, but also everything is touchless, and we're adding scanners to the entrance, not just the exit. And we found that we could do all these things for pretty reasonable price. So if you're looking at old technology and you're saying, well, how do I bridge from my old technology to not necessarily get new technology, at least ask about the concept of, are my old servers part of the issue? And if I upgrade those, does that open up new opportunities that otherwise we've not been talking about? And by the way, one of the things I found in looking at the park systems over the last 18 months is a lot of the stuff that for the people that are out in the field that you're used to interfacing with from these different companies, they don't necessarily know all the stuff that's in the pipeline and that's been developed and it's like ready to come out. And so, it's not necessarily just talking to the same people that you've always talked to at the same company. You may have to peel back and get to a higher level, which right now you can get through any door to talk to anyone you want. So it's one of the things when you have a disruption like this.
That's wow. So essentially, on one hand, Dan earlier mentioned to survive, obviously we need to have contingency plans for different scenarios. But then one part of this new normal is really that the change of sort of how people think about expense or cost, as well as technology adoption. So it sounds like on one hand there is pressure from an investing perspective, from a expense perspective. Everybody's trying to curb the expense, but on the other hand, things can get done a lot faster, and people are trying to do that. And with flexibility from technology providers' side, a lot of the business can be done in a much shorter time frame compared to before. Is what you gents are saying here? Is that accurate?
And you gotta understand that some of the stuff that the sales folks in the field are talking about is they're not necessarily aware of everything in their own companies that potentially is available.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, Dan's, when Arrive modified their business plan and is doing a lot of infrastructure and white label things, I mean, the amount of tools that, I'll let Dan tell you what his tools are, but the amount of tools that they're developing are enormous.
I see. So it sounds like we're already getting into the recommendations down here. Rick, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think Rick hit it on the head. They say necessity is the mother of invention. I think adversity is also, maybe the father of invention, because this has really caused people to think quickly and innovate quickly and be very solution oriented. If you go back 6 months ago, maybe people were spending the time thinking about strategy and all that sort of stuff. I've never seen anything like this, where people are quickly getting on the phone, solving problems. And so, just in the last 2 months, we've been able to come up with new solutions that allow us to work even with the oldest park systems, even things that are, legacy running out of a broom closet somewhere. We've still been able to find ways to make them work for on-demand touchless payments in a way that we couldn't imagine, because suddenly people are engaged. They want to get on the phone. They want to help solve these problems. Yes, there will be an opportunity where people have the capital to upgrade and put in new machines and so forth. And in the meantime, let's solve the problems. And I think we've been really happy with both from the operator community and the parks community, as I said before, with the degree of collaboration to try to solve today's problems, and then also position us for the future, which I think everyone believed that there was a period where everything would kind of go to digital payments in everywhere, grocery stores, parking, everything. And I think that's being accelerated now, and we're seeing it. And so we're here to help.
Awesome. So
hey,
we've already. Go ahead, Rick.
I was just going to act because I'm watching the clock too, and there's I think two things to think about. So I sat in on a webinar for meeting planners recently, and so besides the fact it was really interesting and had a lot of good takeaways, but one of the things they brought up and is that all the trade associations in the United States, that half their budget comes from their one annual big show. And so I think one of the things that's going to change in all these trade associations and industries, so our main trade associations, the two that support our industry in the US and North America, is they have to rethink how the engagement with membership, what do members need, how do they stay relevant. But we as a community need to support these trade associations, because we need them now more than we've ever needed them, and it's a different way. So to some degree, I think don't withdraw from these associations. You got to find ways to support them, and they're going to lower their cost. And the conventions of the future are all going to be mixed. They're going to be both digital, online, and face to face. There will be the conventions that are more drive-in oriented, regional things. They'll be the first ones back. And I think one of the things even some of the national ones are thinking about is, well, do I need to actually do 3 smaller regional so I can have more just of a drive-in? But then you got to reimagine everything. But think about that, because a core backbone in our industry are our trade associations. We need to support them. We need them, and they need everyone's thoughts about how we should work with them. The other thing, because I've talked about, that I own properties as well too. And so, in the case of like all of us who, own parking garages or lots, we were back in March to our bank saying, hey, we need some forbearance because, we're empty, we're closed essentially. And they were all good, but things with banks go from good to bad. And so we know bad is coming. And so I think if you haven't talked to your banks and whether it be operating leverage in your business or whether it be because you own real estate, you better be talking to them. And I think one of the things to also be aware and think about is just how do you preserve that value, and how do you make sure you have maybe new source of liquidity. So I'm a prime example. The Palatine Capital, who's my partner in buying these garages, so we have 3 garages that are all in forbearances, and we went and said, hey, can we waive payments for so many months, et cetera. But we also got dry capital looking for new deals. So it is out there. The market's going to change. No one knows quite what that means yet either when it comes to the ownership of parking properties. But, that's what these webinars and the networks of people are for, is to, if that's your area or your focus. And I think that's where WIN's data is helpful, because when you're talking to banks and you can show data saying this is how the industry is recovering and we are mimicking that, then that also adds richness to the discussion that you're having, whether that be also potentially with a new investor or something like that. So I just wanted to cover off those 2 topics, Win. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Rick, for the calling out. Actually, speaking of that, I should have mentioned earlier, which I do plan on mentioning later, that exactly to your point, Rick, that a big part of our support is from the associations, and this webinar is actually made available by the National Parking Association. And pre-COVID-19, to your point, a lot of these educational sessions, people need to pay for it or membership and so on, and this is a completely free webinar and a lot of good content that are coming out of these associations. So I'll echo your point, say, please, look up to the website National Parking Association. I know they have great offerings these days for people who have difficulties, but still been able to get involved and become a member and participate get a lot of data, information, and useful things from sessions just like this. So yeah, thank you for calling that out.
Aren't you making some of your data available through the associations? The NPA?
Yes. Speaking of that, yes, we're in very closely conversation with NPA to enable exposure of the cross-border data to help the community. And we'll make sure to keep everybody posted in the coming days. With this, it's the same capability, technology-wise, same capability as we showed in the beginning of the session. But yeah, we would want it to be part of the support to the community and make that available. And I know Dan and we actually worked on enabling the exposure of online data beyond the offline data as well. So I'm sure that we'll come to a point that we can all together provide this support to the entire community. Yeah, thank you for calling that out, Rick. So I know I'm watching the clock and we already have a lot of questions coming in. I'll just get to the last question and would love to ask for the panelists' recommendation for the industry peers in the coming months, June, July, August, for the rest of the year, as kind of sort of a parting thought. And then we would love to have your thoughts on a lot of the questions that we've already got from the audience. So yeah, we'll start with you, Dan. What are some of the, let's say, recommendations, conclusive thoughts you would like to offer today based off what we have all observed in the new normal and what we're seeing moving forward?
For me, I think first things first is use the data that you have access to, and if you don't have data, then reach out to us, reach out to Wen and so forth, and talk about how you can get better data. But we don't know exactly how the world's going to recover. We don't know exactly what the patterns will be, and we need to react quickly to that. And so data is number one, and make sure you have good access to data, and don't just naively hope that things go back to normal, because we don't know what normal is going to be. Number two is I think don't underestimate the fact that consumers and the people that do return to work do have choice, and safety is going to be at the top of their mind. And so if you don't have a plan to facilitate sanitization, if you don't have a plan for contactless payments, for digital payments, mobile payments, you should think about getting one. And again, reach out to colleagues, reach out to us, reach out to your parks vendor to start those discussions. And then number three, given that we don't know exactly how things are going to behave, get smart about pricing, get smart about the rules around which you've traditionally priced your product. You may need to adapt them. Again, the early bird rules of the past or the nights and weekend rules of the past may not apply or may not be attractive anymore in a new world when people's schedules are all over the map.
Thank you, Dan. Rick?
So, in our we have a forecast that goes out actually by month to the end of 2022. And so we know that, of course, 2022 is actually just kind of like, all right, we feel sometime in 2021, towards the middle of the year, we'll be back at kind of the revenue target that we have for ourselves. We don't think we're going to get it from the same revenue composition. It's going to be different because it just will be different, and we don't know what that means yet. But we have something we're managing toward, and of course we have it as a slope. But I really think it's going to be a step. You know, well, you're in shelter in place in my chart in Chicago. Yeah, it's kind of a gradual thing occurring, but as things start reopening, it's going to be steps. And I think, and in that context, I think two things. Number one, as Dan has talked about different products besides monthlies, et cetera, our oversell factors are going to become very different. So we might be pleasantly surprised actually how many cars we're putting through our garages, but we're not putting up a full sign because of oversell. So I think we really got to understand the patterns of what businesses are doing, because then that will inform you and allow you to, if the demand is there, sell even more than maybe you found you could sell in the past. And last, I hate to say this, but you know, budgeting, it starts in 4 months, and you need to actually start thinking about it, because this is a whole new world for budgeting too. And I always have said in parking companies, and that's probably true with most companies, that budgets are a negotiation, because they say, hey, we do bottom-up budgeting, and because we want to make it really, really accurate. And then you turn it into whoever you turn it into, and they start negotiating to try and negotiate you up, that why can't you do better? I think in our industry, we spend, and when I was involved with Central Parking, I think this was very accurate for Central, is we spent, you know, 4 months doing budgets, but only a week trying to figure out what the business plan was to hit the budget. I think if you spend your time on the business plan and you don't spend any time on budgeting, you're much better off. Now is the time for business planning. You got to figure it out. In the old budget model, if a parking company is using the old budget model and that whole bottom up thing, which has never really been bottom up in the first place, it's just you're gonna have to start figuring that out. So if you're a leader of one of the companies, you got to think about that now, because if you just wait 2 months, 3 months, you're probably just going to go back to your old ways, and it's not actually going to work very well right now.
Thank you, Rick. So from Dan, Rick, both of you, it sounds like on one hand, the new normal is going to be something no one really knows, and it's important to keep watching your own location's performance on a timely and database fashion. On the other hand, watch out what is happening on the market and really stay on top of things. On the other hand, knowing that the technology providers out there are having flexibility, just ask for those solutions with certain support from them financially, and likely you can get it, and then make sure that the consumers are ultimately taken care of. And also sounds like it's important not only just to think about the budget, which is coming up in 4 months, but more importantly, because no one knows what's a new normal, it's important to test out the new pricing schemes, new programs, and then see how it goes, and then decide what may be the best way to hit the upcoming budget goals versus just spending time on trying to put the numbers together and negotiate. Sounds like that those are some of the recommendations. Awesome. Thank you very much. So we'll get on to the questions now, and I just wanted to say today we have a lot of questions. We may go over the time a little bit. So before we get into the question section, I wanted to thank MPA again for making this happen, for making this available. So please, everyone, go to MPA's website, see the newest program they have to offer for either promotional membership and so on. On the other hand, if there are additional questions about the data information shared by Dan and Rick and myself, please feel free to reach out afterwards, and we'll make sure to send out a recap with notes with everybody's contact info in it. With that being said, so the first question, so first there's actually a comment. Melissa Yates said, thank you, this is positive news regarding the recovery, and thank you for making it happen, panelists. The first question from Doug Young, he says, you mentioned the decline in mass transit ridership. Do you see the same trend with rideshare in Texas? Please, anyone, Dan, Rick, whoever you want.
I know when you just look at Uber and Lyft and their reporting is that they are down substantially. Mm-hmm. And I think it probably varies by marketplace. You know, a lot of their business was tied to airports, and we know that that's not much right now. And then the rest of it's really more short trip in an urban setting. And I think it's something to the order of magnitude of 70 to 80%, you know, down. And I think the sanitation issue is even bigger for them. One of the things that, and I think it's the same sanitation issue as the valet parking as well. It's like, do I want to get in a car with a stranger and I don't know who's been in that car before me? In the case of the valet, am I giving my car to a stranger, and how many strangers are going to be it before they get back? I think Uber's response so far has predominantly been our driver will take a selfie with a mask on, who knows if it stays on, and he's going to have some unknown sanitation fluid that he's going to try and just wipe surfaces. And are they really just spreading it around, or what are they doing? So like there's machines that we've bought at Millennium to do hard surface misting, which kill 99.99% of all bacteria and virus, including corona. But that same machine with that same misting capability, you can essentially in less than 2 minutes mist the inside of a vehicle and the trunk and the door handles. And for 24 hours, it can be certified as bacteria and virus clean. And I think that's what the ride-hail industry is going to need to go to. We are actually looking at business models that says, okay, can we set this up in a place like the Millennium garages so the ride-hails can come in and just do it as a self-serve themselves and get their certification, so that they can then be out there and the app can say, do you want to pay an extra $3 and get a certified, bacteria virus clean vehicle? I think it's going to go that way in all these things, and I think there's lessons to learn for that, for especially how our valet section of our industry, and also all the shuttle buses our industry runs and everything else too.
I'd agree. I've seen already, and we've seen already, that there are some enterprising operators and enterprising folks out there that are actually creating partnerships with ride hail and rideshare companies to provide them with staging areas for cleaning and for PPE distribution and things like that. And I think, where there's perhaps lapses in demand for parking, perhaps those facilities can be put to use in that regard. And I think there's opportunity in that. I do think rideshare will be more favorable than transit for a segment of the population. So it will come back to some degree, but I agree with Rick that they're hurting as bad, if not worse, than the parking industry today. And I think personal cars will prevail when people have access to that.
Thank you, James. A question from David Lan. All the data show number of cars that entered the garages. Where did that data come from? What sensors were used to count? I'll quickly touch on this, and then please. So I think for us on our end, we talk with the park system on site and scan through 900 locations across the country for the off-street and 500 locations or zones for the on-street. So it's really based off the millions of real-time transaction data, and then we synthesize them and then anonymize them and turn them into real-time insights across the board. And then, how did you get your end of the data?
It's the same. We have real-time data on parking start, parking end for all of the online transactions that we have, and so we did the same in terms of anonymizing and synthesizing that. And then Rick's data, I trust, is from his parks and transaction system. So I think they're all similarly rooted in facts.
It's the same thing, because I think every 3 minutes you get a real-time data dump of all of our data. And actually, I used Smarking when we bought the concession back in 2016, when we actually analyzed 11 years of transaction data, in and out, revenue, every metric you could think of. And we actually worked with a consultancy in London through Wynn's dashboard, which was very early in the business at that time. And we correlated essentially all the activity of the garages to the US GDP, Chicago Metro, and a bunch of other statistics as well. And really, as you said, when the parking industry in the US really follows the economic activity or GDP growth in the US. And that's what we did. We found it did. It was over 20 million transaction records with the associated number of fields. So, I mean, this is all good data. And it was a Smarking chart I showed. So.
Thank you, Rick. Question from Mark Brown. Thank you all for providing this webinar. Dan, do you think the data collected showing commuters parking earlier than pre-COVID dates are essential employees coming in to clean areas to start the business day, and not necessarily people eager to get back to work?
100%, and I think I commented on that. As I do think the patterns we're seeing now may not stay the same patterns. I do think the people that are driving into city centers tend to be more essential workers, so hospital workers and so forth, that that have to get into that are required to get into buildings. So again, I don't know that those patterns will stay as they are today, but I think the meta point is the patterns probably aren't going to just go back to where they were. There's going to be some new pattern that emerges, and whether or not it sticks at 5 in the morning or people start at 10 a.m. because they're dealing with childcare, we'll see.
I'll add 2 quick points to that. Number one is, I think it's also going to change whether you're parking lot or garage, what kind of building does it service? So if you're in a 1 million square foot office building, right now the building ownership and management are telling the tenants, you have to space your employees out because otherwise they can't socially distance lobbies and elevators. Yeah. So it would be like, all right, if you're going to bring in 10 people, 2 at 8, 2 at 8:30, 2 at 9, 2 at 9:30. And so until the buildings don't need to socially distance elevators, et cetera, now small buildings maybe don't, but large buildings, that's gonna be a factor. The other thing that's going to be a factor is if people aren't spacing out and they start congregating back into normal commuter patterns at time of year on the highway, then the highways and the local roads are going to get really congested because of the movement, at least in cities where there's a big movement of people from mass transit. Louisville, as an example, I mean, mass transit really isn't used by white collar workers, so it's not going to have any bearing there. But those are a couple more things to think about.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Dan. So Dan and Rick, do you guys still have a couple more minutes to cover several more questions? We'll try to.
Couple more. Okay. I got a hard stop in a little bit.
Just a couple. Yep.
Just a couple. Okay. A question from Brian Debach. With the available data, are you noticing the same trends for valet assistant, and roadside valet operations in markets that have opened?
I can't really speak to markets that have opened. Yeah, because none of my markets have officially opened, or they may be officially open, but not really. People haven't really been coming back. So.
Yeah, so I would say outside of New York City, where New York City is heavily valet, and we've you can't distinguish between valet and not valet really. Outside of that, we've definitely seen restaurant valet stands and hotel valet stands, which were a large part of our valet segments outside of New York City. Those definitely are not turned back on yet. Those sites are still remain shut down. And we hear from a lot of hotel managers, we hear from a lot of restaurateurs, they're just not going to bring back valets at all. And so for us, one of that is potentially an opportunity for us where we could provide restaurants and hoteliers with widgets that market nearby parking and things like that. It's the same opportunity for nearby operators to go to those folks and say, hey, maybe you've shut down your valet for now. Why don't you tell your customers to park in our garage and let me give you a rate for that. There's some opportunity there.
One of the old things we did in the industry a long time ago and hasn't been around that I really see is one-way valet. So sometimes in big cities where there's traffic, a lot of traffic congestion and one-way streets is where you usually saw it. But one-way valet is have a valet at the front of the restaurant or hotel to take your car, but then they'll give you directions about where your car is when it's time to go. Because we got to find a way to lower the price point of the operating cost. So many of the hotels and even restaurants went to, essentially, well, the hotel will take a piece of the revenue and the operator gets a piece of the revenue and has to arrange the parking and pay for all the costs. Those have all blown up. And we've clearly, to Dan's point, we've had a lot of hotels in some of our markets come to us and say, hey, can I get a self-park rate? Because we need a certain occupancy before we could ever bring back a valet. And so, it's going to take a while. I'm sure it's going to be very localized, though.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Dan. One last question we'll take care of today, and we'll make sure to cover the rest in our recap. Question from Kevin Juan, Enza Parking Corporation, SFO. Any thoughts on off-airport parking trends for the next few months?
Not good. No, I mean, it's I had founded and was the CEO of an off-airport parking company when 9/11 occurred. And so we saw our business go way down, obviously, because people weren't flying. But an interesting story, one of our senior executives was on Amtrak going to Washington, D.C. shortly after 9/11 and asked some people, well, why are you taking the train? Why aren't you flying or whatever? And they're like, well, I don't know when I'm going to get back on a flight. And he asked this one woman, And she said, no, I don't have any clue when I'm going to fly again. And he's like, have you ever been to San Francisco? No. Would you like to go? Yes. If you could buy a plane ticket for $200, would you go? She said, oh yeah. So she immediately changed her mind. So I think in the airport travel space, it's the job of the airlines to stimulate with price cuts demand, and it's the job of the resorts and other places, because leisure is the biggest part of travel. I think the business travel will come back more slowly because it's a lot of that travel is just very discretionary, and a lot of that may not come back. So I know the ends of property have been bought many times. So if you are oriented to more business travelers, you really need to start looking at the leisure, because they will come back first if patterns repeat. And I think you need to find new ways, or maybe old school ways to attract new customers, because you're going to need new customers. The pie gets smaller, it's going to stay smaller for 3 years, and you're going to need to be able to attract new customers. Now, I did that after 9/11 in a way that you can't as a single location, but I did it with a lot of barter, because what the heck, I got empty space. And the channels I chose to use that in were predominantly leisure focused. I wasn't thinking about it at the time, but it's the way it turned out. And basically, if I gave away 2 days free, but I got a traveler who was going on a 4-day trip, which was the average length of stay, then I got a new customer and I got 50% of the revenue. And we actually found that we recovered much more quickly than the marketplace. So I think there are strategies you can do, and I'm happy to actually share some information when you get my contact info.
Thank you, Rick. Any thoughts on your end, Dan? Off the airport.
Nothing to add. Nothing to add. I think Rick nailed it.
Awesome. Thank you all very much. Again,
All right.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Rick. Again, this session was made available by MPA, and we greatly appreciate the opportunity. And we will have a full recap after the session coming out today or tomorrow. So yeah, please reach out to all panelists, including myself, if there's any other questions, any interest in seeing more data and understanding what's the new normal. Thank you all. Have a wonderful Wednesday.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Rick.
Thanks, Rick. See you later.